So before I start, just a quick introduction. I'm going to be talking about farmer mental health, not my own mental health, obviously, but actual farmers. And I've got a couple of terms that hopefully won't pose too many problems. But one of them is less favoured agricultural area. So I won't explain that. I explain it in the speech. The National Farmers Union, the Just Farmers Network, and the Common Agricultural Policy. And I think that's all the tricky stuff I've mentioned. There's going to be a lot of figures, so enjoy. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk about mental health for those people working as farmers or in the agricultural industry in general, with a specific focus on the situation in Northern Ireland, but also branching out into wider context as well. So Northern Ireland has approximately 30,000 farmers and a total farm workforce, which incorporates farmers, families, and other members of this farming workforce, of approximately 49,000 people. A key characteristic of farming in Northern Ireland is that 70% of the agricultural area there is defined as less favoured, which is a label introduced by the EU to recognise areas where agricultural activity is a lot more difficult because of the natural conditions of the land, of the weather, of the general fertility or suitability of the soil. The most common forms of agriculture practiced in this area is livestock grazing for the purposes of either milk, meat, or wool production. And so this kind of ties in a little bit with what David was saying in his speech in the French session. Farm incomes here in Northern Ireland, rather, are highly reliant on subsidies from the European Union Common Agricultural Policy, or the CAP. Farm business income across all different types of farms, so not including payments from subsidies, was calculated as being £6,745 per farm in 2017 to 18. So let me get that straight. In 1 year, there was less than £7,000 of income. Farm business incomes, not including subsidy payments for just cattle and sheep farms, were actually negative for that same period. And that means that these farms would probably, or in fact almost certainly, not be viable without the subsidies provided by the EU, by governments in general. Now, in addition to the fact that the income received from farms is extremely small, farmers are facing another, perhaps even more pressing issue, namely mental health problems and difficulties. It's difficult to say just how extensive mental health issues are among the farming community in Northern Ireland in particular, because there are no kind of definitive quantitative statistics that relate specifically to local farmers. But this is also compounded by the fact that, as you may well have guessed, mental health issues are extremely complex, and they can range along a continuum from just mild stress or more severe stress, even through anxiety and depression to varying degrees, and at a more extreme end, suicide even. And so it's really hard to capture an accurate, comprehensive view of the whole situation relating to mental health. But a local charity has, or rather commissioned a study in July 2016, which looks at the health and social impacts of the agricultural downturn of the situation in Northern Ireland. This used both survey responses and qualitative interviews to create a final report, which revealed a significant number of respondents with concerning or very concerning mental health situations. So as you can well imagine, this situation is extremely serious. But this problem is not merely confined to Northern Ireland, but it affects vast swathes of the farming populations in the whole of the UK and beyond. And in fact, relating back to the issues we mentioned before, more than one farmer a week in the UK dies by suicide, which is a huge statistic and one that needs to be combated immediately. So to relate this speech back to what my colleague David mentioned earlier, the issue of meat consumption has been extremely sensitive for farmers. In early 2020, the National Farmers Union, or the NFU, said that the anti-meat agenda had become a huge added strain on farmer mental health, and that demonizing livestock farmers was having real life consequences. Obviously, these issues facing farmers and facing the whole environmental crisis to do with meat consumption is not simply only the fault of the farmers, but the fault of a wider system which is at play. But the farmers themselves feel like they are being the ones accused of perpetrating this entire system. NFU President Minette Butters mentioned in a speech recently, and I quote, "People need to remember, at the heart of every farming business is a family. In a world where there seems to be increasing polarization, we mustn't forget that we're all human." Well, perhaps tell that to the animals going to slaughter, but we won't dwell on that here. Anna Jones, who runs the Just Farmers Network, said she had witnessed a complete collapse in self-confidence among farmers due to the ongoing debates about veganism, about farming, and the general practices involved in the industry. She said, "They feel vilified and attacked all the time. And for them, it's not just a job they do from 9 to 5, it's their whole life." In fact, within Great Britain, research completed by the Farm Safety Foundation revealed that 80% of young farmers under the age of 40 believe that mental health is the biggest hidden problem facing farmers today. And 92% also stated that promoting good mental health is absolutely vital in order to save lives in the farming community. A 2012 study of farmers in the UK, as well as their partners or spouses, which was based on 784 face-to-face interviews, found a higher risk of psychiatric disorders among farmers and their spouses compared to non-farmers. In 2015, a national survey of the mental health of Canadian farmers revealed that 45% were classified as having high levels of perceived stress, and while 35% met the criteria for being depressed. I have now reached 7 minutes, so if you would like to swap interpreters. Great. So what are the causes of mental health issues among farmers in Northern Ireland and beyond? Well, there appears to be no single common cause for mental health issues among farmers, but there are a number of factors related to the actual business of farming, the nature of the farming community that could also be contributing alongside the others we've mentioned, including the following. I'll give you a list. So firstly, one that we may be familiar with in these lockdown times, but social isolation and the solitary nature of the work. This is a huge contributing factor to farmers feeling alone, feeling like there's no one to turn to with their mental health problems. Well, secondly, long unsocial hours, a lack of time off work, particularly as the home is very often the same as the workplace, so there is no boundary there. In addition, there are also time pressures. There's the pressure of record keeping, meeting regulatory requirements. There's also the very unpredictable weather, which, as you can imagine, in somewhere like Northern Ireland, it has a huge impact. Working with multi-generational family members or just members of your family can be very tricky. Or in fact, conversely, many children leave the farm for education and work opportunities, which places a huge amount of stress on the older generation, not knowing where their farm will pass on to. Often there's the stress of moving from running a family farm in the past to running a business with a business mentality, and that's causes a lot of stress. There is a lack of access to health and support services, particularly because these farmers, they lack time, they live in remote areas, sometimes it's very difficult. Farmers are suffering from an aging population as the rest of the society, but among farmers even more. There is reduced social interaction as farms become much larger, increasingly mechanized. The requirement for a human workforce has been reduced, so there are fewer people to interact with. There are also financial worries, as I mentioned before. This extremely low income has to be a concern, but there are also issues to do with the volatility of income, the reliance on external debt and direct payments. And that relying on external sources can be extremely worrying. What if these payments are removed? And what, if anything, replaces these direct payments from the CAP after Brexit? And there are also problems on the farms, such as outbreaks of pests or disease or things like that that are completely out of one's control. There are hazardous working conditions, such as the heavy machinery, the livestock, the chemicals involved, etc. And there is also the stigma, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but the stigma surrounding mental illness. And this prevents many people, especially those in a family farming business, those who are expected to have a stiff upper lip, it prevents these people from seeking help and from admitting they have an issue. Now, as I've noted as well in that list, many of these factors are outside of the control of the farmer. And all of this kind of compounds to create this feeling of being a hostage to fortune, of being a slave to a destiny that's outside of their control. And that, in many instances, may also bring added pressures and stress in itself. So what are the potential consequences of mental health issues for farmers and farming families? Well, at the most extreme end of the mental health continuum, as I've mentioned, suicide in farm families causes huge consequences, as well as on the wider rural families and communities. Often these families have been very well established and have tended to dominate many of the headlines around farmer mental health. And obviously this extreme example of suicide, of loss of life, is extremely tragic and can have a catastrophic impact on the farming family, the farming business, and the community. There do, however, appear to be more nuanced impacts, but still significant ones. Poor mental health can have a disastrous impact on one's physical health, as well as causing a loss of income from work absences. It can significantly harm any business, especially one with such a tiny margin of income. There is also some evidence that suggests poor mental health can increase the risk of injury through accidents. And of course, this is a huge concern for farmers driving huge pieces of machinery, using chemicals, doing all those things. So that's a particular concern there. And what can be done? How can we resolve this issue? Well, one key challenge remains the need for more extensive data and statistics, both on the scale of mental health issues in the farming community and also a greater understanding of causes and effects of poor mental health. This would undoubtedly assist with identifying, developing approaches to deal with this issue. But it should also be noted that there probably also needs to be a conversation about who should be responsible for coordinating, delivering these interventions, this support. Who is responsible for making sure that farmers are taken care of? Of course, farmers themselves can begin to take individual steps to tackle their own sources of stress and poor mental health. Research has found that many farm families don't see stress as a health problem, but they see it as a farm problem. This means that many people are less likely to seek professional help from doctors or from counselors, but rather try and power through without seeking any help at all. There is a general feeling in rural communities that only mentally ill people go to psychologists and psychiatrists, and this mental illness label can be extremely stigmatizing and can result in people not using the services that they desperately need. So we need to raise awareness among farming communities that there is nothing shameful about using mental health services. Stress, depression, relationship problems, and financial problems do not have to be suffered in silence. And alongside these steps, to come to a conclusion, measures need to be taken to ensure support is there for people who so desperately need it, as well as those who might be prevented from getting mental health problems if they'd only just access the support in advance. mental health among farmers is a very significant issue, and it needs wider awareness and support to ensure it is tackled efficiently and in the right way. Thank you very much for listening.